Do you really love me? Hey, why are you looking away?
That's not very romantic. But this... now that's romantic. Of course, when I say romantic, I'm saying it with a capital R, referencing the Romantic period of British history. The period of thought was born as a response to the cold calculation and objective truths of the European Enlightenment. If the keywords of the Enlightenment are objectivity and rationalism, the Romantic period could similarly be branded as subjective and sentimental. Central to this style of literature is the idea of landscape and its effects on an observer. Poetry operating in a romantic mode is elevated beyond mere nature description in that it focuses more on a speaker's subjective reactions to the sights and sounds of the poem's studied object. Let's take a look at an example. John Keats' "Bright star, would I were steadfast, how thou art." The narrative thrust of this poem is as follows. A guy looks at a star, and then feels some stuff. But the poem's literary merit comes from the vicarious subjectivity of that viewing presented by the speaker. William Wordsworth sums it all up by saying that the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature, and that, quote, all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Wordsworth, Shelley, Coleridge, Keats, Byron, all these dudes carefully observed, then sensuously described their subjects, especially natural ones. This description would, in turn, elicit a profound reflection or epiphany in the poem's speaker, ideally rousing a similar response in the reader. It might seem kind of strange, but a lot of video games do this, and have, in fact, been doing it all along. Disc 1 of the original Final Fantasy VII mostly takes place in Midgar, a steampunky, seedy urban space filled with corruption, garbage, and dark color palettes. Nearly everything the player sees is a tapestry of urban decay and stifling surroundings. But once the player completes the boss on the bridge, we're treated to this shot. This is a romantic moment. The player realizes, perhaps for the first time, they're about to leave the city, experience the freedom and beauty of the natural world, explore all the unknown places tucked just over the horizon. This type of moment is extraordinarily powerful in video games. After all, Bethesda ripped it off for a reason. But these are just moments, single instances of, going back to Wordsworth, spontaneous overflows of powerful feelings. What would an entire game of this nature look like?
Dear Esther, the morning after I was washed ashore, salt in my ears, sand in my mouth, and the waves always at my ankles, I felt as though everything had conspired to this one last shipwreck.
So these are typically branded as walking simulators, right? However, I don't think I like that term. I mean, players do a lot more in what remains of Edith Finch than just walking around. And newer games, such as Becalm, don't even feature walking at all. So, for reasons to be explored shortly, I'm rebranding these as romantic games. So, real talk, I actually quite like stuff like this. When they're done well, they can be supremely evocative experiences, and the genre as a whole shows a whole lot of promise. Mechanically, players usually have little to do other than move around and experience things. And because these are digital, interactive pieces of media, these moments are always some kind of audio-visual set piece. Sometimes there are collectibles and some light mechanics, sure, but the environmental interaction is mostly or exclusively exploratory and observatory. Even if a romantic game has items, they tend to only unlock special sequences of audio-visual set pieces, cosmetic changes, or extra textual achievements or trophies. But romantic games can come in two flavors, each with their own set of issues. Let's call them secondary and primary sublimity, with sublimity meaning the quality or state of being sublime. From a literary perspective, the sublime is a staple of romantic poetry and is a blend of delight and, in a way, terror. Apt adjectives to consider are vast, obscure, and powerful, but really any imagery crafted to invoke awe is on brand. Consider the differences in these scenes from Majora's Mask. These trees are just trees, but this tree and its presentation are the sublime at work. With that in mind, let's take a look at the more common of the two flavors, A walking simulator with secondary sublimity will always have a defined character the player inhabits. Dear Esther, for instance, places players in the shoes of an unnamed narrator who recounts the letters he sent to his deceased wife. As the player moves around, audio snippets are cued by moving into certain areas, typically informed by the player's surroundings. For the character, these muted vistas are romantically sublime, stimulating reflection upon their viewing in the form of spoken word audio clips. The potential issue with secondary sublimity is that these moments of delight and terror are occurring twice removed from the players themselves. While the sight of the waterfall cave evokes tremendous sensation in the protagonist, there's a risk that players, for whatever reason, won't empathize, rendering the cave just a cave. The barrier between player and character is far less permeable in this type of romantic game, but this shouldn't suggest a definite weakness. Because the interaction depends exclusively on the context and writing, it's simply a matter of personal taste and experience that will encourage or inhibit empathy on a player-by-player basis. On the flip side, we have primary sublimity. In this form, the players themselves are the intended target of this spontaneous overflow of emotion. Arguably the first example of this is 1998's PlayStation classic LSD Dream Simulator, but now there are many others. In primary sublimity, everything from the visuals to the music to the controls are carefully cultivated to elicit an emotional response on the part of the player. But these too pose a risk. Without the guiding thrust of having a speaker or text, there's a danger that players will not have an emotional reaction at all. After all, how many negative reviews of walking simulators boil down to "this was basically pointless"? Regardless of the intended target, romantic games are identified by a lack of environmental resources to collect and a direct fail state imposed by the game's ecology. The purpose of these games, then, is an evocative experience instead of a challenge, the invocation of a spontaneous overflow of emotion, just like Wordsworth would have wanted. Throughout the course of this study, I have inadvertently created a functioning model of video game design and theory. Join me next time as I put all the pieces together and bring my video series, EcoGaming, to a close.
Thanks for asking me out. See you soon.